Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time we're going to be speculating on what the full title for the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild could be. Right now it's a bit of a mouthful, the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. That's what Nintendo's been coining it since its initial trailer back at E3 2019. It's already been about 2.5 years, which interestingly is the longest amount of time we've waited to get a full title reveal from the initial trailer of a Zelda game. Why are we waiting so long? What's going on here? Well, we'll get into that later into this video, but there's a hope that the wait is nearly over. Some people are speculating, myself included, I'm even predicting that we'll be getting a title reveal at the Game Awards this year, and that's just about a week or two away from the recording of this video, so we're pretty close. So in anticipation for a potential reveal, I feel like it'd be fun to make the speculation video and maybe try and figure out what the title could be. Now, a couple things. One, we don't know if Zelda will show up at the Game Awards. We don't know if there will be a title reveal, but eventually there will be, so this video will still be relevant even if we don't get the big news we want at the Game Awards. But another thing that should be brought up here is that there are so many possibilities when it comes to the name. If you think about different Zelda games and what names they actually received, from an outsider's point of view, without knowing too much about the game, it's kinda random. Before they revealed the name Twilight Princess for Twilight Princess, that was kinda shocking that that's what they came up with. The initial trailer didn't necessarily suggest Twilight Princess. So it may not be very easy to figure out the full name for the sequel to the Breath of the Wild just from the information we have already, but I think it's going to be fun, and upon sitting on this idea for a couple days, I actually think I might have a decent idea. So let's talk about it. Now before we jump into things, let me very quickly talk about my social media. You may see a few different things here on screen. You can check that all out. It is linked in the description below. And of course, if you like what you're seeing here, you can subscribe. So there's actually quite a few different things that are going into my thinking as to what the name could be. The first thing I want to bring up is just that with pretty much every Zelda title, they usually have two nouns for the subtitle. Skyward Sword, Twilight Princess, Breath of the Wild, Breath and Wild, Ocarina of Time. You see my point here. There's usually two big sort of words that stand out with each subtitle, and they relate to something. But usually it relates to a character or an item that's pivotal in the game that impacts both the gameplay and the story. But with Breath of the Wild, it was a little different. We're still not entirely sure what Breath of the Wild means 100%, but it's an interesting name that does seem to sort of relate to the overall world, and that's what series director Eiji Aonuma and Nate Bildorf told us in an interview. So let me go ahead and read this excerpt from an IGN interview back from E3 2016. Even the subtitle itself is different from previous Zelda titles, Aonuma said. In past games of the series, he explained, Nintendo would use item names like Skyward Sword or character names Twilight Princess as a subtitle for a new game. For this project, Aonuma worked closely with Nate Bildorf from Nintendo's Treehouse over the span of many months before they landed on the name Breath of the Wild. It took a while, Bildorf said. We talked about a lot of plot points and items and characters, but what we kept coming back to was that the world itself is really the soul of the game. To Bildorf, the stark final image shown in the trailer really represented what the game was all about. The ruined, crumbling masonry and the quiet field with a breeze running through it. The sense of melancholy that pervades this place, what was once a beautiful kingdom is now fallen to ruin, really felt like the soul of the game to us. We found a goddess statue sitting inside the ruined Temple of Time, Bildorf described. The sad scene sets up so many mysteries that appeared to be an integral part of the next Zelda. Really, the world is the main character, Aonuma added. So with Breath of the Wild, what they focused on for the title was the overall world, which is the core element of the game. It's what makes Breath of the Wild so special, so they chose a name, Breath of the Wild. And when you think about that name, it's interesting in a variety of ways. One, and I'm not sure if this was intentional, but it's just something to consider, breath is not too different from breadth, and breadth can sort of allude to the expansiveness of Hyrule this time around. And when speaking of air, breath, it does also relate to the open air concept of Breath of the Wild, which is supposed to be an expansion of the idea open world. They wanted to go beyond just a typical open world style of gameplay. And then when they use the term wild, that alludes to this wild world, this world that is a post-apocalyptic Hyrule that is abundant with nature and natural forces. Even the main antagonistic force of the game is more of a force of nature, the Calamity Ganon. It's something that is wild. So the terminology Breath of the Wild relates to the wild nature of the game, the openness of the game, the breadth of the game. Breath of the Wild. So it definitely makes sense when you think of it in that way. But thinking of the naming of Breath of the Wild in some ways may make it easier to perhaps figure out the naming for Breath of the Wild too, but you could also argue it makes it harder, because the naming structure for previous Zelda games is just related to a core item or character in the game, but when you look at what they did for Breath of the Wild, well, it could also relate to a mechanic or just an overall feel of the game, so really it just opens up even more possibilities here. But another thing to consider with this name is just how long we've waited. Why have we waited so long? Well, technically we already have an answer. So back at E3 2021, just a few months ago, Bill Trinen from Nintendo of America said this: "As for why we're holding back on the name, you'll just have to stay tuned because obviously Zelda names are kind of important. Those subtitles, they start to give a little bits of hints about maybe what's going to happen." So basically here, Bill Trinen is telling us that we don't have the name yet because it tells us some things about the game that Nintendo's not ready to divulge quite yet. So with that, it actually makes things potentially even harder to figure out here, because it's entirely possible that Nintendo has not given us enough information to surmise what's going on. But it's also possible that whatever name it is, once we see it, we're going to get some crazy ideas here that may relate to what we already know and what we've seen from the first two trailers. And again, we probably don't have enough information. It's very unlikely that I'm going to get the name right. We're really just doing this for fun, but I'm going to take what we do know and try to piece it all together here. So based off what I've discussed so far, the name likely is going to have two nouns in it that will relate to some sort of core concept of the game, be it a pivotal item or character, or just the overall feel of the world. But also potentially this name will suggest something to us upon seeing it. It may spark a lot of ideas or remind us of a concept from Breath of the Wild or a previous Zelda game, and that's why Nintendo has not revealed it yet, because it will indicate some things about the game that they're not ready to show off quite yet. So this information may not boil it down to just one or two little things. It does give us at least a bit of a window here. There's almost an infinite amount of things within this window, but at least I feel like with this information we can maybe ballpark it. Maybe. So where do we go from here? How can we get closer to a potential name? Well, we have to use the information we already have, and what we have are these two trailers for the sequel and obviously Breath of the Wild and the entire history of The Legend of Zelda. When looking at the two different trailers, there's a few concepts that come to mind that I think sort of span between both trailers. And if it's an idea that spans across both trailers, I think that makes it more likely to be something that they may want to convey in the title. If it's an idea or concept that spans the entire game, that is pivotal to the entire story and gameplay of the game, then it definitely has a strong chance to be the title of the game. So looking at both trailers, there are four concepts that come to mind to me that perhaps could relate to the story. Now, one of them may seem a little weird, and I'm not entirely sure if it's even worth mentioning, but a lot of people bring it up, so for that reason I'm going to be bringing it up as well. And that's time, because people love to talk about time when it comes to Zelda, but it does relate to the other concepts here, so I'll get to that. Now, the obvious other one is Ganondorf. In the first trailer, we see this character, this corpse, coming to life. The character is garbed in Gerudo, it has long red hair, it has the yellow jewelry, even has a hole in the chest which is reminiscent of the hole in the chest from Twilight Princess. This character is very obviously Ganondorf. Is it possible it's not Ganondorf? Sure, but it's a very small percentage, and I would say it's almost certainly Ganondorf. And we see this character coming to life in the second trailer as well, and in both trailers, Ganondorf is causing calamity, havoc, he's destroying things, he's causing Hyrule Castle to rise from the ground, There is a rising here, a resurrecting here. So perhaps this will relate to the story of the game. You have this pivotal character, this important character of the entire series, who is coming to life, who is coming back, and maybe that's what the title could be relating to. Perhaps the title will have something to do with Ganondorf himself. Maybe the title could have Ganondorf in the name. Maybe it'll be Ganondorf's Return, or the resurrection of the Demon King, or something like that. I don't think that's completely out of the question, but I would say it's a little unlikely. Why do I think it's a little unlikely? Well, my personal vibe is that they're not going to just straight up put the name of Ganondorf in the title for the game. But, you know, Link's been in the title for a few different Zelda games, and so has Zelda. Well, literally every one, because it's called Legend of Zelda, pretty much. So maybe Ganondorf deserves to be mentioned in one title finally. So maybe they do actually go in some sort of direction like that. But with Ganondorf making his return in the sequel, it actually brings in another concept here, which isn't directly shown off in the trailer, but I would say is hinted at, and that is the Triforce. Now, the reason why I think the Triforce is another one of these important concepts that is brought up in both trailers is because with Ganondorf, we now have Ganondorf, we have Link, and we have Zelda. Throughout the different Zelda games where they've all been at odds with each other, or, you know, important pieces to the story, they each had a piece of the Triforce. Ganondorf with the Triforce of Power, Zelda with the Triforce of Wisdom, and Link with the Triforce of Courage. But interestingly, in the initial Breath of the Wild, there is no Triforce until the very end of the game. It just shows off the Triforce when Zelda is sealing away the Calamity, and that's it, there's no more. Link doesn't have the crest of the Triforce of Courage. Ganondorf isn't even a player in the story for Breath of the Wild, even though he is the source of the Calamity. Point is, the Triforce is just mysteriously missing. So perhaps in Breath of the Wild 2, with now Ganondorf being a major player and Zelda potentially having a more active role in the story even though she falls down a hole, we could see the Triforce coming back to the forefront to the story this time around, like previous Zeldas. So it's possible the title could heavily relate to the Triforce. It could have something to do with the title, maybe something like the Return of the Triforce, or the Collection of the Shards, or something like that. That's not impossible either. But also, the Triforce has been important throughout most Zelda games, and I can't think of a time where it was directly mentioned in the title either. So I would say that one is also a little unlikely, but still, whatever this title is, I do think it's going to relate to both Ganondorf and the Triforce, because I think both of these concepts will be really important to the story and even maybe the gameplay for Breath of the Wild 2. Now, I mentioned time earlier, and the reason I mentioned time is again because most people like to think of time, but it actually sort of relates to these other concepts here. So Triforce has been a power that's been around for many, many years. But then with Ganondorf, you have this corpse that's been around for potentially beyond 10,000 years, and we are exploring these ancient ruins, and we even see these old cave paintings in the initial trailer. So there's certainly an oldness to this world, and Breath of the Wild 2 will be the latest game in the timeline. But then on top of that, we do even see a time manipulation mechanic shown off, and that's when Link's hand has a flash of some sort of shining gold light, and he's able to stop that steel metal ball in time and then reverse it. So there's a time mechanic there. But these three different concepts relate to another concept, I think, that is also in both of these trailers. And that is the Zonai. So hear me out here. You may not know who the Zonai are. The Zonai are an ancient tribe, and all the ruins with like the different animal heads and these tall towers and these giant mazes, those are from the Zonai, an ancient warrior tribe that is no longer around. But what people have noticed from the first trailer, there's a lot of these Zonai ruins that Link and Zelda are exploring, and at the very end, there's Ganondorf. So perhaps there's some sort of relation between the Zonai and Ganondorf. And actually, when you reverse the initial trailer for Breath of the Wild 2, and if you slow it down a bit, it makes it a little bit easier to hear, there are these voices, and they're saying, help us throughout the trailer. It's very dark, it's very scary. But the idea here is that there are souls that are trapped in some way because of Ganondorf, and yet we have this ancient tribe that has mysteriously disappeared, and we're exploring this tomb that has Zonai ruins. And what makes things even more interesting, there are a lot of these luminous stones all throughout this underground area, and the description for the luminous stone in Breath of the Wild is, this mysterious mineral gives off a pale blue glow in the dark, which some believe to be souls of the dead. So the idea I'm getting at here is that perhaps there are souls that are lost from maybe even this ancient tribe, the Zonai, and perhaps Ganondorf has something to do with that. Perhaps he has some sort of source of nutrition or power. Maybe it's from the souls of the lost Zonai. And what makes things more interesting, the sequel trailer has this green, wispy-like glow to it, these little lines, these texts, and this green coloring sort of is reminiscent of the greenish area from Faron where the Zonai are. Now the reason I bring this up because I also think it does tie to not just Ganondorf, but the Triforce as well. Since we are seeing Ganondorf come back, the idea of this triangle of 3 characters, Zelda with the Triforce of Wisdom, Ganondorf with the Triforce of Power, and then Link with the Triforce of Courage. So we actually see Link use this power to reverse time for a moment in the second trailer, and there's this golden shine in his hand. Well, we're talking about how maybe the Triforce can make a return, and maybe that shine in his hand could be a hint towards the return of the Triforce of Courage to Link. And we even see Link have this weird sort of power on his hand that has a bit of a green energy flow to it. What if in some way Link has to be saved from this resurrection of Ganondorf and it relates to the Zonai, and maybe he has some Zonai powers? And this all sort of is symbolic of the Triforce of Courage. And what makes this interesting is because we also have the Yiga who worship Ganondorf or Ganon, and they are garbed in red, and when we see the Calamity, it is usually with some sort of red dark energy, so that's all represented by red. And then with the Sheikah, it's all represented by blue, and the Sheikah have always been the ones to protect the Hylian family, specifically the Princess Zelda, who is the holder of the Triforce of Wisdom. So maybe there's some sort of connection here. Maybe there is a connection between the Triforce and time and Ganondorf and the Zonai, and they're all important here. So I feel like it'll be weird to straight up mention the Triforce or Ganondorf in the title, and time is more of a subtle sort of element here, not something that is seemingly a really big deal, but of course you never really know, they could show off something really crazy here. But the Zonai, on the other hand, are a relatively new concept where there's a lot of mystery behind, and they could use a sequel to Breath of the Wild to really expand on this idea, and we already have hints towards that with these trailers. We see this green glow, we see these luminous stones that supposedly are relating to lost or dead souls. When we reverse the footage, there are these people begging to be saved, and also we need some sort of explanation as to how Ganondorf has been here this long and how he's still alive, maybe because he's using the souls of the lost ancient tribe, the Zonai. And with this possibility of the Triforce returning and there being these different tribes that relate to each one, that also makes this idea of the Zonai playing a more pivotal role even more important. But then also in the second trailer, we talked about these voices. We do actually hear the voices again. Now, I haven't been able to sort of piece together if they're saying anything specific, but those little whispers, they're still there. So I think there's a pretty good chance that the Zonai are going to relate to the title for this game. And similar to previous Zelda games, normally there's some sort of item or mechanic that is pivotal to both the story and the gameplay. Well, we already see this weird hand armament or power-up that Link gets in the second trailer. And it has this green-like energy, and it does seem to maybe potentially relate to the Zonai. And, you know, there is that power of time and such, and there is a golden shine which could relate to also the crest here. You may notice how there's all these potential connections. So what if the name relates to all of this connection to the Zonai here, and all of a sudden we have this concept that relates to both the gameplay and the story, and what makes Breath of the Wild 2 so different compared to Breath of the Wild 1. Maybe the story of the Zonai here could also explain what's going on with the sky. Something interesting is that there are a lot of these tall, giant sort of stone towers all throughout the world of Hyrule. And I'm not talking about the Sheikah towers, I'm talking about these random stone towers. And these are from the Zonai. They are more Zonai ruins. Perhaps that could also relate to this connection to the sky. There's a lot of potential or possible connections here, and maybe not all of them will actually be connections, but there's a possibility here. So let me get down to what I think the name could maybe be. What I'm sort of getting locked down to is whispers of something related to the Zonai, because we hear these voices in both the first and second trailer, a recurring idea, but an idea that's relatively new to the series that could strongly relate to all these core concepts here. So what could it be? Whispers of the past? Maybe. Whispers of the void? Maybe. Could it just be whispers of the Zonai? I feel like that's just a little bit too blatant, so I'm gonna say Whispers of the Lost. The Legend of Zelda, Whispers of the Lost. Now, it likely isn't that name, but that's the name I'm gonna sort of conclude with for this video. I think it's something that is a little dark. It does hint at the darkness of the game, but it also hints at this lost tribe, this ancient people, the Zonai, who could play a pivotal role to Link's power-ups, the explanation as to why Ganondorf is still around, the connection to the sky, and everything else. They could be a very important piece to the puzzle here. So that's the name I'm gonna go with here, and probably be wrong, but I'm curious what you guys think. Do you guys think The Legend of the Whispers of the Lost could be it? Or do you think it's something else entirely different, or something along the lines of what I've been saying, but a little different? Let me know in the comments below. Let's speculate on what that name could be. We're all probably going to be wrong, or maybe one of us will be right. Maybe we'll find out in just a few short weeks. Anyways, everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.